Thank you very much indeed, Mark. An excellent, very comprehensive overview of the issues there. So let us move on then to Chris McCabe and Robert Cook from Defra on fisheries and marine policies. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, so morning everybody. So I've got the fairly challenging task of trying to summarise fisheries management in a couple of minutes for you all. But I guess the key takeaway from this is that fisheries and its management is very, very diverse. It's not just fish and fisheries. For example, I think the UK government negotiates every year for about 120 different fish stocks. And there is about just over 6,000 active fishermen across the UK. And they fish in vessels all the way from boats that are bigger than most of our research fleet, down to ones that are about 2 or 3 metres long and are sort of operated single-handedly a couple of miles from shore. So first of all, I'm going to start at the top. We've got the Fisheries Act in 2020, which was designed as our kind of the primary framework for which we'll manage our fisheries into the future as we left the EU and to replace the common fisheries policy. And if anybody hasn't read that, obviously, I would very much have a quick read of the first of the 8 objectives that are in the Fisheries Act. And they act as a guideline then to kind of show fisheries managers how we should balance the priorities in our fisheries going forward. But the Fisheries Act is very much designed as an enabling act, and what that means is that it's designed for things to come underneath that through secondary legislation. And specifically, since the Act has come into force, we've now got the Joint Fisheries Statement that kind of links together the UK administrations and how we will manage our fisheries going forward. And we are just starting to get fisheries management plans now coming online. So the first 5 of these were published late last year for crab, lobster, whelk, sea bass, some of our more important sort of non-quota species. So there will be another 40 of these fisheries management plans coming online in the coming years, and they will have to take into account offshore structures. And each of these plans will need to be revised every 6 years, and they will have to reflect our changing seascapes, particularly in the North Sea. So, for example, there is a management plan being developed for cuttlefish off the southwest at the moment, and that is specifically looking into the role of offshore structures for the laying of cuttlefish eggs and how that is going to change potentially the productivity of that fleet. And this will touch on a lot of the stuff that Paul Fernandez mentioned in his talk yesterday about how these plans need to reflect the changing environment that we're particularly going to have in the North Sea. And then I'm just going to quickly highlight some of the other large kind of policy type regulatory things in this environment. So first one, always front and centre, is the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is obviously sort of the Brexit deal. That is actually up for renegotiation in 2026 because amazingly, it's been sort of 5-6 years since that came into force, and time flies. That obviously, when it came to force, has changed the balance, particularly in the North Sea, fishing opportunities for different fleets, and that could change again in the future and could potentially be up for renegotiation every 6 years. But again, the fishing opportunities that are available to the different fleets is probably going to change as we get more, we get some spatial squeeze and we get more offshore structures coming online. And then just on the spatial squeeze, again, Paul mentioned this report yesterday is one by ABP Mayor for the NFFO and SFO, I think. And this kind of shows the percentage of the UK EEZ that is off limits or has restricted fishing activities. So obviously we were only at 0.3% in 2020. That is already over 23% now, and there are various forecasts then going out to 2030 and 2050, if you read the report, all the way from sort of 36% up to 2050. And that very much depends. But with that spatial squeeze comes choices. There's behavioural choices from different fishing fleets. There's going to be displacement. There's going to be fisheries gear innovation, co-location within these offshore structures. But again, as I touched on before, there's well over 100 different fish species, fish stocks to be fished, all the different impacts, and there are different fishing fleets that are operating, and they will need evidence to support, and regulatory and managers such as myself and others will need good evidence to kind of enforce, mitigate, allow, facilitate these kind of changes that we're going to see in the next decade and beyond. And then I haven't even touched on the changing environment that we're going to see in the next decade and beyond in the North Sea. We will see species shifts. We will see ecosystem changes, and we will see policy priorities change. For example, the ban on sand eels is an example of how the UK is now diverging away from what the EU might want to do to take an ecosystem-based approach to protect our seabirds. And we'd probably like to see that going forward in the future. And again, the last one, which is one of the Fisheries Act objectives, is that national benefit and how the fishing industry fits into that picture. But hopefully that's a very whistle-stop tour of fisheries management and priorities in the next decade. So I'll hand over to Chris.
Oh, sorry, you
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. Brilliant. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Chris McCabe, and I'm going to give a very high-level overview of our policies and commitments, priorities in the UK in our marine environment. So first and foremost, the government has responsibility to protect and enhance our marine environment, and these objectives and commitments are outlined in the UK Marine Strategy and also in the 25-year Environment Plan and the subsequent Environmental Improvement Plan of 2023. We also have the UK Marine Strategy in order to achieve good environmental status in our seas, and as noted before, with our neighbouring seas in consortium with OSPAR. I think of particular note for this conference is what's been discussed by John this morning and yesterday, and that's the OSPAR Decision 98.3, which I won't go into because we've already seen that in depth, but what I will say is because of its powers of and its responsibilities to decommission offshore oil and gas platforms and infrastructure, that consideration will need to be taken looking forward if we're to revise or look at that again. Looking internationally, on international policies and priorities, there is a recognition more widely of the importance of marine spatial planning and prioritisation, and we're working with international partners to deliver on targets outlined in the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Commitments to the Global Biodiversity Framework would include efforts to reduce, halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, including the 30 by 30 goals. So that's protecting at least 30% of land and sea for nature by 2030. Looking more domestically into my areas of expertise, we have the HPMA and the MPA network. Now, the MPA network is probably one of our primary tools for protecting the marine environment of the UK. And we have about 374 MPAs across the UK, which aim to get that protection, that level of protection there. Through the Environmental Targets MPA Regulation 2023, a target of 70% of the features within these MPAs are to be in favourable condition. And when we talk about this decade of decommissioning that we're in right now, there's an interim target to have 48% of those MPA features in favourable condition by January 2028, with the rest of the features with the rest of those features in a recovering condition. Looking to HPMAs, or highly protected marine areas, since the 2019 Bennion Review into HPMAs, we've designated the first 3 of these sites in 2023, with more to be designated in the future. The monitoring of these sites is a much longer commitment beyond this decade of decommissioning, and we've committed to that beyond the span of this decade of decommissioning, working incredibly closely with JNCC, Natural England, CFAS, the MMO, and the IFCAs in order to design, designate, consult and manage these sites into the future. Now, as the management of these sites is stricter and they offer the greatest levels of protection in our MPA network, there needs to be consideration taken to the displacement of activities and the spatial prioritisation of these sites, introducing more holistic approaches to management and an early evaluation process put in from designation. Looking to offshore wind, we have the British Energy Security Strategy, which was introduced in 2022. Now, this outlined ambitions to deliver 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which also included 5 gigawatts of innovative offshore floating wind as well. And related to MPAs and offshore wind, there have been consultations conducted in the past on the guidance of MPA assessments with offshore wind infrastructure. Now, what this shows the British Energy Security Strategy and these consultations of offshore wind and MPAs in tandem show an awareness of the expansion of the offshore wind network and those balances required in order to balance out this spatially limited marine environment that we have, which I think is one of the most important considerations of this conference. So looking at all these elements together and these priorities over the next 10 years, we can see that there's an incredibly high ambition, essentially, and a diversity of ambitions, but also diverse and complex challenges. I think the most important being that spatial squeeze in a limited marine environment, but also, whilst balancing that we want to conserve the marine environment, to preserve biodiversity, to introduce appropriate management measures, whilst also ensuring that the users of the sea can use this environment in a sustainable manner. However, this unique challenge that we're all facing now and in the future has allowed us to develop approaches which look at the marine environment in perhaps different or innovative ways, or in holistic ways, such as I've seen in our highly protected marine areas, which consider a whole ecosystem approach, through our new Natural Capital Ecosystem Assessment Programme, which looks at a natural capital approach, so looking at things not only ecologically, which is what I'm probably more used to, but also economically and socioeconomically. And into the future, as we look into more innovative spaces and integrative and cumulative effects, which we can talk about later. What I also feel like this unique challenge has invited us all to do is to focus on collaboration. So we have wonderful programs that I get the privilege of working with, like EcoWind, the Sustainable Management for Marine Resources, or SMMR, and we have excellent things like Insight, like we've got today, and then brilliant groups such as COAST and HEBSEG and PSEG and the Impacts Evidence Group, and loads more. What these all emphasize is the importance of communication, collaboration, and engagement with that wider scientific community, like we're doing today, and it's an incredibly valuable resource where we all gather that evidence together to answer these difficult, complex policy priorities and these commitments. Thank you very much.